Hey, so today I want to look at what is probably the biggest comics anthology ever published. The Comics 2000 anthology by l'Association. Look at this thing. 2,000 pages of comics. So let's take a look. So this book was published in 1999 by l'Association, and I'll call them Lasso from here on because my French accent isn't so good. But it was published in 1999 in honor of the new millennium. And apparently it was a running joke for a while among the publishers in France of like, hey, the year 2000, we should do a 2,000-page comic book. And nobody was really taking it seriously until they did and decided to actually do it. And again, this is the result, over 2,000 pages of comics. And according to the introduction here, this book contains 324 different artists from 29 different countries. And so it's quite an impressive achievement. And I remember hearing about this, and then I ordered it. It's the early days of the internet. Ordered it online, and I can't imagine what the shipping must have been to get this to me from France. But they did it. I have heard that artists who took part in this, some of them weren't paid for this, so there's all kinds of issues. I don't know the truth of all that, but it is an impressive brick of a book. And if you ever get a chance to see it, I really recommend, flipping through it. But that's what I want to do here in this video, is flip through this thing. I'm only going to focus on a few of the stories that I like or that I think would be interesting to look at in terms of how they're structured. But I'm also going to intersperse those things with just me flipping through the book so that you can see just how much diversity is in this thing. I mean, again, it's 2,000 pages of comics, so you'd hope it'd be diverse. But there's two things that are interesting to keep in mind about this. One, all the comics are black and white. They didn't pay for color printing, unsurprisingly, in the 2,000-page book. But also, because this is an international book, again, most of the artists are from France and from places in that area of the world, but there's artists from the United States and from Japan and other places as well. So there's no one language, right? So what they decided to do is also require that all the comics be completely wordless. So these are wordless comics also. So there's two restrictions here. And when I first read this, again, in 2000, I was really inspired by the amount of wordless comics, and it really made me want to do wordless comics and really made me appreciate the power of wordless storytelling in comics. Anyway, so let's take a look at some of the things in here. Okay, let's start out flipping through this book. The first thing I want to point out to you is the paper here, and you can't feel it, but they're super thin. They're almost like Bible pages, and I remember thinking when I first got this book that this is like the comics Bible. Anyway, we start off here with a story by Jessica Abel, and all the stories in the book are listed alphabetically by the author's name. And they're all black and white. They're all basically wordless. I mean, sometimes there's words, I guess. But they're all basically wordless. And a lot of them are on the theme of the millennium, of what's happened, and what people are hoping or worried about in the future. And as you notice as I flip through this here, just the amount of different styles that are on display, different approaches. And you might notice art or artists that you recognize, but I'm sure there's a lot here that you've never seen before, right? And that was definitely true for me when I got this book. It was very eye-opening, very inspiring, because just so much. One story early on, and by early on I mean page 345, is by Philippe Corday. And it's, this very simple story, but I love this loose, loopy line work. About this thief who breaks into somebody's house. He takes these people hostage, and then he takes all their money and he runs. But then he takes off his costume and he comes back and then rescues the people, and they want to give him a reward, so they show this money that they had hidden that the thief hadn't found. So the guy actually ends up with all their money. It's just a funny little concept, and I just love the way it's done. And again, I just want to give you a sense of some of the work that's in here. And because of the time period, there's a piece by Mike Diana. Anybody here remember Mike Diana and his work? And I want to just show this piece just because I really like the art. It's this really simple line style, but it has this really shaky line. But it's, very carefully laid out. And the perspective here often has a very flat perspective, kind of like Egyptian hieroglyphics or something. There's no sense of kind of Western sense of perspective. But it's just a really nice little story, and I just love the art style. And of course, Julie Duquet, or is it Doucet? I've never known. And anyway, just another glimpse at some of the different styles of art in here. And I wanted to call your attention to this story by Sergio Garcia. It's basically Little Red Riding Hood, but I want you to look at how he's laid this thing out. We basically have 4 horizontal strips, and this happens on all the pages. All right, so this is a constant kind of layout. And if you look, each strip has a setting or character associated with it. So the first horizontal strip is always just the forest itself. And we just get deeper and deeper into the forest, and then we come out the other side. But that's all that's existing on that top tier. The second tier is the Little Red Riding Hood tier. We see her going off into the forest, and then here she is in the forest, and eventually getting to grandmother's house. The third tier is the wolf, right? There's his story. And the fourth tier it changes, but in the beginning it's the grandmother's story, and then eventually it's the woodcutter's story. And so you read each horizontally, but they're all happening at the same time. But when characters from the different tiers, strips meet up, then all of a sudden you have this double panel, right? And so here we have Little Red Riding Hood, here we have the wolf, and here they meet up, and so now we have this bigger panel where they meet up. And I just love this design sense. And this happens again, you see the wolf go off, and he goes to grandmother's house, and so he enters grandmother's strip, and so we get a wide panel here of their interaction. And again, I just think it's a really simple kind of idea, but you don't see this very often, and I just think it's really clever and here it works really well, I think, very affecting. And so when we get to the end, where basically all the characters together, we actually get a vertical strip of panels to get the end of the story. Again, I just think the way this is laid out is so cool, and just simple yet very unique. It's not something you often see. And again, just to give you an idea. Oh, I remember liking this story a lot too. And here's Tom Hart's Hutch Odin story. And what's cool about this, and it takes you a while to realize that it's told completely backwards, kind of like that movie Memento. And this story is really interesting too, by Mark Hendricks, that basically kind of about masculinity and worked toys. It's hard to talk and flip at the same time. And I wanted to show you this Dylan Horrocks story, which is really smart, of course, because it's Dylan Horrocks. But he chose to do a story about the millennium about the Holocaust. And so you have what looks like a comic about this Jewish woman. And what's interesting is there are no words. And you have the space for words to be, but there's none there. And it's such a cool choice because it shows how, the voices of these people were taken away. Not only their lives, but their stories, right? And what's interesting as this progresses, and it progresses through the early days of the war, the edges of the pages look like they're torn or burnt away, and there's less and less and more dark space. And here she is entering one of the camps, until there's nothing left except smoke, and it gets smaller and smaller, and that's all we have. It's such a powerful little story. And again, just flipping through so you can see some of the stuff in here. Oh, this is a really cool one. Sorry, I forgot about this one. There's so much stuff in here. It's easy to forget about things. This is
where's the beginning? Here we go. By Olivier Josso, and it's called Sand. But it's basically a story about art and the inspiration of art. And so we have the birth of this person who ends up becoming an artist. But as he's giving birth, it's like the mother has this. To me, they look like potatoes that she's having a vision of. But then he's born. And he goes off to some artist's atelier, right? And he sees the artist's studio, and he's really inspired. And so he ends up becoming an artist himself. But he has this dream, and again, they look like potatoes to me, which he draws, and that becomes his drawing. It's called Sand Boy, that somebody else finds and is inspired by, who is himself an artist. And so it's a story about where does artistic inspiration come from, but also how one artist inspires the next artist, and how it goes from generation to generation. Again, just more of a sampling of some of the art in this book. I really like this drawing style. Here's Megan Kelso. All right, so after this story about a guy who sodomizes himself with a cactus, you have this story by Xavier Lowenthal. And it's a comic that uses this technique that you don't see very often, but I've seen it before. Maybe you've seen Gustave Verbeek's The Upside Downs, things like that. But it's a cartoon where it's drawn one way, where you read it upright, and then you turn the book over and read it the other direction. And I like how it starts with this user's guide here, and I guess, yes, there's some words, but it shows you how you're supposed to read it. You read through, and then at the end, you flip the book over. And that's how it's done, is it's the story, and you read it across the bottom, and it's about this guy who gets this external brain, which makes him smarter, but causes all these problems. And then you get to the end here, and you flip the book over, and you get the second half of the story, which involves this character, and the two stories are interrelated. But it's just really cool structure. And again, I've seen other comics like it, but not very often, right? And I think partly you don't see it very often because it takes a lot of planning to put these two things together like this. But it's really cool and a cool idea. Just a look at some of the other art in the book. This Nicholas Mahler story. Mats. And I remember really liking this story by Morvandow, if that's how you pronounce his name. It's kind of like The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, perhaps. It's hard to tell if it's a fantasy or not. But, there's this guy who's just a normal guy, but then he puts on this disguise and goes on a life of crime, and he holds up this bank, and then, they call the cops on him, and, so he has to escape, and he's being shot at. Then hold off the cops, and it just gets more and more absurd where, there's a motorcycle, and then there's a car crash, and there's a helicopter crash, and there's a monster truck, and there's these acrobats on a motorcycle, and he's shooting them all off. I mean, it's this great last panel where he's sweating, trying to fend off all these attackers. Again, it's absurd, really fun, but then, like The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, then he goes back, and no, he just has to put the groceries in the back of the car, right? And again, I thought this was a lot of fun, to kind of playing on these 80s movies tropes. Another comic in here that played on 80s movies tropes was this one by Nash. And it has, the classic end of the movie setup where there's the hostage exchange and there's the good guy, and I'm assuming he's good because he's wearing white, getting the hostage, getting the woman he's supposed to save finally at the end. But, he realizes he's going to be double-crossed, and so he shoots down all the guys. But there's one left. And the guy left, calls him a jackass, right? And our hero cannot take being called names, apparently. It makes him so angry that he just kind of goes overkill mode and just keeps shooting this last guy. And he is in such a state that he forgets the woman he was there to save to begin with. Anyway, at the time, this was really eye-opening to me. The idea that you can do basically an 80s action movie, but you don't have to do it in any particular style. You can do it in kind of this loose, slightly cartoony style, and it reads really well. It's still fun and funny, right? And again, I found that very inspirational the first time I read this. And again, just some of the art in here. Oh, here's Javier Olivares. I love his art, and this is a cool little story about like a vampire detective who ends up dying because the sunlight goes through his magnifying lens. and Thomas Odd. His work is so dark and cool. And then there's this story by Tobias Schulkin. Um, it has it has a feel kind of Dave McKean's Cages, especially the way the trees are drawn. But it's definitely its own thing. And Tobias Schulkin can draw anything he wants. He's pretty incredible. And I don't totally understand this story. It's definitely obscure, or what's the word I want? Hard to understand what all the symbolism mean in here. But it's really captivating. And again, the drawing is amazing, and there's these interesting uses of space and interesting layouts. And this last scene, which again I don't really know what it means, but these last two panels I just find really affecting and moving in a strange way. It's got a dreamlike logic to it. Anyway, if you've never seen his work before, it's always really obtuse but just incredible, and sometimes strangely moving, like this story. And again, there's just all kinds of different styles, different approaches. There's Ted Stern. I remember this story is really cool. And just to show you, Chris Ware is in here too, with his version of Superman, which is always funny and disturbing. And Winchless, whose art is always really interesting. I remember this story by Yule. It's very cynical and negative, but it's very powerful about how women are patronized and not taken seriously. She wants to play with trucks, and she's given dolls, and she paints this incredible painting and no one notices it. Then her brother does something that's just really a scrawl, and then he's rewarded for it. And her whole life's like this, until she gets patted on the head in this patronizing manner. And there's some sexual violence there. And then the last, just the nail in the coffin, almost literally is, she's patted on her grave. And it's not a hopeful view of humanity, but it's a very powerful little piece. And one of the last pieces in here, again, we're getting up to page 1976, is by Daniel Zezelj. I'm not exactly sure how you pronounce the last name. And it's just, the artwork is amazing, but it's also this guy, mostly it's this guy dancing. And you see the interplay of his form, but also the lines that compose his body. And it's just a beautiful piece. And I'm glad it's kind of near the end of the book. And it just is because it's his last name. It starts with a Z. But it makes for this kind of beautiful, artistic, hopeful, but also very real moment of joy in the middle of this city where there are cracks and things on the sidewalk, and things are not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but this guy's still dancing. And again, that's one of the last pieces in here. And then that's it for the book. And then what's cool is that at the end, though, they do list by page number who the artists were and where they're from and where you can get in contact with them. Again, this is from 2000, so a lot of this probably doesn't apply anymore. But still, it was they were trying to give credit where credit was due and use this as a way to get attention for these artists.
So that's a brief look at the Comix 2000 anthology by Lasso. Again, probably the biggest anthology of comics ever published. Now, just to clarify, I don't mean that by size, right? This Kramer's anthology is probably the largest physical comics anthology ever published, but as you can see, is not nearly as many comics. So I mean, when I say largest, I mean just sheer amount of stories and artists present. Anyway, this is probably not a book that you're going to be able to buy. But I, look around. It is floating around at different libraries, different places. So check out your local library, see if they happen to have this, or if you're visiting places like Tom Hart's Sequential Artist Workshop in Florida. I know he's got a copy of this. So there are certain places where you might be able to find this. And again, I recommend you flip it through it. It is almost overwhelming, but a really cool thing, and I'm glad they actually pulled it off and that this actually exists. Anyway, just another crazy book in the Mullins Library. Thanks for watching.